Yeah, I like abortions. We do need more abortion rights, though.
Why are abortions so important to you?
Because I don't want my daughter growing up in a world where she doesn't have 24/7 full term rights to abortion. She needs abortion rights. I want her to have the rights that I only wish I had.
So you're saying you wish you could have aborted your daughter?
All right. Spencer Case is a philosopher professor. He is the host of the Micro Digressions podcast that I've been on a few times. I know he's written numerous things for Thousand Word Philosophy, and I don't know. He's very productive. What am I forgetting, Spencer? Oh yeah, of course. Is Morality Real? A debate by Matt Lutz and Spencer Case with a forward by just to show what a small world all this is. Somebody who's couch I've stayed at before, Neil Sinababu. So welcome to the show, Spencer.
It's great to be here. Thank you so much.
So I was listening to a little bit of a episode of your podcast, Micro Digressions, that you did on abortion. So I feel like I might have a little bit of idea. I'm still not totally clear, but you suggested this might be something that'd be interesting for the two of us to talk about, and I thought maybe since my own position on this is pretty boringly standard, right? I think that whereas my suspicion is that a lot of the sort of bioethics kind of literature on this, right? You probably spend more time keeping up on than I do, right? But I mean, I have pretty standard kind of normie leftist views on abortion rights, but I think it might be more interesting maybe to start with you giving us a general sense of where you're coming from.
Yeah, all right. So I thought this might be useful to begin with a little bit of framing here, because one of the things I've noticed is that if I hear an argument from somebody who I know agrees with me about a bunch of stuff, it automatically sounds like a better argument to me.
Sure.
Like I can't, it's irresistible. And it's got to mean one of two things. Either there is something to ad hominem argumentation, or it matters who's presenting an argument, or we're just really, really systematically irrational, or maybe both. Both could be true. So I mention this because I often get the sense, especially online, people are not attacking the arguments, they're attacking the kind of person they imagine to be giving them. So any kind of as you sort of saw from the other side with that video, of course it's some idiot with blue hair, just who believes all of the other woke stuff, but they could have picked an antagonist who shares some of their beliefs, but no, it's those other people who believe those stupid things. It's all, so the image that the online left thinks they're arguing against is the troglodyte wearing the MAGA hat, tobacco juice dribbling down the chin, swilling whatever has replaced Bud Light as the beverage of choice now that that's too woke. So, but I want to emphasize that I think the fact that abortion is a right cultural issue is really kind of contingent.
Mm-hmm.
I really don't see anything inherent about it that makes abortion a right-wing issue and animal rights a left-wing issue. And by the way, I'm very sympathetic to animal rights and animal welfare. I'm a vegan, have been for about 10 years. And so maybe I'm not the most expected antagonist here. So I do think when pro-lifers argue, they often make the mistake of trying to argue for the most robust kind of pro-life position, which in my mind could possibly be correct. The position that every abortion is like a serious moral wrong from the point of conception. My view, that could be right, but the arguments that purport to prove it, I think, rely on premises that are dubious. So I just don't think that those arguments get the job done. I'll give you a couple of examples. So one popular kind of argument relies on the premise that like a fetus or a conceptus even is a human life. I think that's just empirically true. But then there is the normative premise, the moral premise that says every human life has the full slate of human rights, like inherently, essentially. And I just think there are other counterexamples to that, right? Like if I'm in an irreversible coma, it's no longer clear that I have all of my human rights and moral status and dignity and stuff. So that's kind of not a good way to argue. There's a similar kind of argument by Alexander Press where he says, I was once a fetus. I had more moral status is like inherent to me. And so if I have moral standing now, I must have had it then. I don't think that argument is compelling for the same reason, which is maybe moral standing is something that I acquired along the way. So those are things that those are pro-life arguments I have doubts about. I think a more productive way to go about this is to start with like minimal pro-lifism. Are some abortions seriously wrong? And I think that is a lot easier to establish. And then once we have on the table some abortions are morally wrong, then I think we can start debating about, okay, where to draw boundaries, where to draw lines, what would a principle of moral caution push us to accept. And so that's kind of the way I think of it. So I'm open to fairly radical pro-life views, but I haven't seen an argument that has convinced me that you have to go that far. But I am persuaded that at least some abortions, and I think many abortions, are seriously morally wrong.
Gotcha. Yeah. So one thing that does immediately jump out at me about that, right, is that the whole framing of it is about, the moral status of the fetus, which is obviously one important issue right here. I mean, like it'd be silly to say that it was irrelevant. Obviously, it's very relevant, but it's certainly not the only one. And it's not necessarily the point that's always seemed most compelling to me on the other end, right? So, if you kind of think about the basic, like, normie pro-life argument, right, goes something like this, that, first premise, that it's morally wrong, and if we're being a little bit careful about this, we could add in terms like generally, right, because there are exceptions that the pro-lifer isn't going to think are relevant here, but it's morally wrong to kill persons or human beings, or some term like that, right, that there's some sort of category that you've got of bearers of moral status. Premise 2, fetuses fit within whatever category that is, right? So conclusion, it's wrong to kill them. And it seems to me there are two basic ways of resisting that, both of which, to be clear, I think I would sign on to, right? But the second one might be the one that I personally would put more emphasis on. So the first way of resisting that argument is just to push back against the idea that fetuses are part of the whatever the category is that we think has a right to life. And I think I am not very open to the sort of radical pro-life position that you said. It's not particularly obvious to me why a fertilized egg has more moral status than an unfertilized egg, even, right? In both cases you're talking about something that's literally mindless. And if you think about the kinds of things that make us usually think that something is the right kind of entity to have moral rights, I mean, even in the certainly when it comes to people, but even when it comes to like some of the animal ethics stuff that you mentioned earlier, there being something that it's like to be it, right? Seems to be pretty crucial to that. So I think that I'm very I do think that like the further you go along in pregnancy, the more blurry, right? That's going to get after a certain point. But certainly when it comes to like relatively early abortions, that my understanding has always been is the bulk, right, of abortions, where it's implausible from what I know about the scientific literature on this to think that that you're talking about something that has the capacity for consciousness, never mind anything else, like the kind of brain that can support consciousness. I am very uncompelled by the idea that is yet something that has moral rights. But then the second way of resisting that argument that I just said, the one that I think it actually feels a bit more powerful to me, is the argument from bodily autonomy, right? That this is that we generally think, right? I think that people's right to control their own bodies is a really serious, profound, important right. Like I think here about like the analytical Marxist philosopher G.A. Cohen has this example where he's like trying to convince his fellow socialists to take self-ownership intuition seriously enough to like sort of go with him into the nitty-gritty of the argument about it. And he says, look, if we imagine a future science fiction dystopia where we got really, really good at curing blindness by transplanting the eyeballs of people with 2 working eyeballs, transplanting one of them into the eye socket of somebody with 0, and then we instituted, a la the Vietnam War draft lottery, we instituted like an involuntary eyeball lottery where, if you were the unlucky winner, you had to have one of your eyeballs transplanted against their will. You could make all of these kinds of egalitarian fairness arguments for it, but like I think nearly everybody across the ideological spectrum would be like, no, you can't do that, right? That would be a really, really seriously unjust thing to do, right? Or I'm sure you're familiar with the basic outlines of this, but I mean, just to kind of rehearse, the sorts of things that people think about when they think about this, dying of kidney failure is a really like spectacularly horrible way to die, right? And people die that way all the time, right? And in the U.S., there aren't enough donors. It's a big problem, and people talk about all sorts of ways that you could get more, kidney donors. Should you, have either a public or private way of like paying people to donate kidneys, whatever. But something that I never really hear just about anybody advocating is that we should legally force people to part with one of their kidneys, right? Since that seems like it would be a really serious violation of the right to bodily autonomy. And even with stuff like the COVID vaccine, there were a lot of arguments about what the acceptable limits were of among people who were who'd been tricked by big pharma into believing the vaccines worked, right? There were all these like arguments about the limits of like what you can do to like pressure people to take the vaccine. But again, I almost never, right? I mean, I know there are people, of course, any position you could find somebody somewhere who holds it, right? But like an extremely rare position would have been, we should just have like the CDC go around from home to home, doing like SWAT raids and holding people down, to give them their shot, because we think that would be a violation of bodily autonomy, right? And it's always seemed to me that that forcing somebody who doesn't want to be pregnant to remain pregnant would actually be one of the more severe violations of bodily autonomy. I mean, certainly way worse than making somebody take a shot. And so I'd just be curious about your sort of where you generally land on how far this set of concern takes us when we're thinking about, the right to abortion, or whether you just think that this stuff is so obviously trumped by the fetus's right to life that it's sort of not on the map, or where you come down on this.
Right. Thank you. Just to sort of crystallize what you said, because it's pretty clear. But I think if there's one thing people could get clear about in arguing about this publicly, it's really when the debate is the morality of abortion, there are really two issues here. One of them is what is the moral status of the fetus? And the second is how should the rights of persons be weighed against the rights of bodily autonomy? And I think once we just have in mind that there are two distinct issues here, it can be clarifying. So I think the whole notion of viability playing such a central role, I suspect that comes from in like the argument. I suspect that comes from confusing these two things, right? Like the ability to survive independently of the mother does not seem to, as far as I can tell, I don't see any plausible argument for why that should confer inherent moral status, but it is relevant for the autonomy kind of consideration. And so I think these two things get kind of mashed together. So, do you want to focus on the autonomy stuff, and then we can talk about the moral status stuff later? Because I think it's best to pick one at a time.
I'm happy either way. I just kind of wanted to sort of lay out the basic map of the disagreement, and then whichever one. Yeah, sure, we can do it that way. Let's do it that way.
Okay. Yeah. So I'll begin with the autonomy stuff. This typically gets traced back to this article by Judith Jarvis Thomson, as I'm sure you know. Mm-hmm. She had this famous thought experiment. I'm rehearsing it for the benefit of anyone who doesn't know it. I know you're familiar with it, where you've got to imagine you've woken up in a hospital and you're hooked up to some guy, this violinist who's dying of kidney failure, and he's hooked up so that he's using your kidneys, and the doctor says if you unplug, that's going to kill him, and so the question, but you have to be hooked up to him for 9 months, and then he'll be okay, and then you can leave, but you'll kill him if you unplug before then. Do you have an obligation to stay plugged into him? The intuition you're supposed to have, and which most people have, is no, you don't have that obligation. So the thought here is that, it would be wrong to force people to make a greater sacrifice of their bodily autonomy than they're required to do. David Boonin has a book called Beyond Roe. I don't know if you're familiar with it. He's making an extension. I actually recommend reading some of the later developments of Thompson's argument rather than the original one. The original paper, I think, is kind of convoluted. Also has the worst thought experiment of all time, which is the people seeds, where the people seeds thought experiment is totally ridiculous. Like, you're supposed to imagine, imagine these like little people seeds that float through the air, and what if one of them took root on your carpet and started growing into a person? Could you vacuum your carpet? It's like, that is a paradigm case of how you do not design a thought experiment. Yeah. So I love, I think I do have a much more positive sort of general take on the paper than you do. If people are curious, I actually wrote an obituary when Thompson died in Jacobin. So this is in 2020, and I talk about this a little bit there. But I think I actually have a line in that article where I'm like, okay, I don't love the people seeds. I think that the point she's making with it, right, is that like the first step is supposed to be that like, okay, if you're being really careful to make sure the people seeds don't get in, then sure, it's fine to vacuum. And then like, even if you're maybe not that careful, sometimes you accidentally leave it open, the window open, and it's still okay to vacuum. And so I think that I get the structure for point. I think the illustration is badly chosen because I don't think that anybody anywhere has clear intuitions about what they think about people seeds, because like, how could you? That's, it's so distant from our anything that, that we actually have moral judgments about. I think
I think there might be a way of getting at the same point that she's trying to make with People Seeds. That's slightly different, which is.
I think I'm about to give it to you. I think I'm about to
give it to me.
Okay. So Boonin, in this book, Beyond Roe, he has one of the better variations of Thompson's argument. He points to a real court case. It's not a Supreme Court case. It's a local court case. I think it's McFall v. Shimp. Okay. So basically, what happened was this guy, I might be confusing who is in what role, but this person had bone cancer from exposure to asbestos, and he needs a bone marrow transplant. Okay. And he has a rare marrow type, and it turns out that he finds out that his cousin is the right type. His cousin refuses to donate the marrow, and so he sues him, and he is not successful. The judge, Flaherty, I think it was, said that it's just outrageous. You don't have a right to another person's body. That would completely destroy the whole basis of law, right? So he did not get the marrow transplant, and he died. And the whole book is like building on that case to make a legal case for abortion, I guess, after Roe, because I think it's a number of people have thought that this would be a firmer foundation on which to found a constitutional right to abortion. But I'm just considering it here as a moral argument. I don't know about the legality of it. Morally, does who is it? McFall have a right to Shimp's bone marrow? It doesn't seem like it. Okay. So what do I say to the autonomy argument? I mean, I guess the first thing to note is that there do seem to be limits to this right to bodily autonomy. You were emphasizing positive duties to others in the previous segment of this very episode. Thompson herself, in the original article where we get this argument, does say some things that say, well, there are certain cases where it would just seem to be indecent not to allow the person to use your body for a little bit. Like, what if McFall just needed a blood transfusion, right? Maybe the law shouldn't compel it, but it does seem indecent to let somebody die over that. And another thing, this is, I think, the biggest objection I have to Boonin's argument there is he relies on the fact that this is one super rare, weird case. He's relying on that very heavily. What I want to know, this is one objection I have. What I want to know is, if it were the case that every cousin, like with every cousin pair, one of them is going to need a blood transfusion from or a bone marrow transfusion from the other, or millions of people were going to die, don't you think we'd have different intuitions about what our rights were and what the limits of bodily autonomy were? Don't you think that would be built into our law?
I'm actually not sure it would be. I mean, I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but I mean, I think kidney failure, for example, is not particularly rare. Right. So, and it nevertheless is not built into the structure of our law that, you have to give up a kidney against your will. Right. So it's all, which is just to say, I mean, that it's at least not obvious to me that if this were a much more common situation, right, or to bring it a little bit closer to pregnancy, that, was something that would be not like something that was always going to come up every time, but, was a sort of well-known common, development or something. It's I mean, maybe you're right, but it's at least not obvious to me that our laws and our moral intuitions would be different.
Okay. I think I disagree about that. I'll move on to other points, though.
Yeah. So let me just circle back for a second, right? Because I did just want to briefly ping off two things you said, right? So one of them was about positive rights, and the other one was about the sort of People Seeds and and the role that those are playing in Tom and Judah Jarvis Thompson's argument. So it seems to me that, like, the point of that right, in the paper, at least as I've always read it, right, was, okay, if you have the intuitions that, that Thompson thinks you'll have, and I think we agree most people do have, although, I guess for full, just full disclosure here, I've met people who don't, certainly, right, but that most people are going to have about the sick violinist case, that the Society of Music Lovers, kidnaps you and hooks you up to the famous sick violinist, and if you detach yourself, you'll die. That the intuition that Thompson thinks you'll have, and most people have, is that it might be very noble of you to decide to be hooked up, but you shouldn't have to, and it would certainly be unjust for you to be like legally forced to. And one common reaction to that, right? I mean, of course, obviously, anybody who's taking an absolutist pro-life position will just say, I think that whatever principle you can extract from this just doesn't apply to pregnancy, at all, right? For reasons X, Y, and Z. But like another common response is to say, well, maybe this sort of case shows us that in some cases bodily autonomy can outweigh the right to life, but the sorts of cases where that can happen might be the cases that would involve like pregnancy due to rape, but they wouldn't be relevant to pregnancy resulting from consensual sex. And and I think that the point about the people seeds, right? I mean, it's like I think that is we agree it's not a well chosen example, but I think it's supposed to address that. And I get what you're saying about the McFall case, which is actually it was actually really interesting to hear that. But like it's always seemed to me, right? You could even extend the original argument, right? Like like without having to bring in anything as hard to wrap your head around as people seeds. Say, look, imagine Society of Music Lovers kidnappings. This wasn't like a one-off thing, right? This was a big social problem, right? That the Society of Music Lovers was always kidnapping people and hooking them up to sick violinists. And if you're sort of trying to judge this idea, right, that consensual sex, amounts to consent to eventual pregnancy, which even like the McFall thing sounds like in that case, we're thinking about case where, consent is withdrawn later, right? But like, if you're even trying to judge, hey, is consenting to sex consenting to pregnancy at all, right, in the first place, right? Never mind whether it's withdrawn later. Look, extend the metaphor. Society of Music Lovers kidnappings, big social problem. You live in a neighborhood where there's very little Society of Music Lovers activity, and you voluntarily move to one where it's more likely, right? Maybe you got a job there, maybe you like the nightlife better, maybe it's where all your friends live, but you don't want to be kidnapped, right? So you take, let's do the equivalent of the screens for the people seeds, right? You take all sorts of measures to protect yourself from being kidnapped. You install a home security system. You get a guard dog, but maybe every once in a while there's like a particularly effective, Society of Music Lovers team that like Ocean's 11's through all that stuff, and you get kidnapped anyway. The fact that you voluntarily did something that raised the probability somewhat doesn't really seem like it amounts to consent for that outcome. And
I agree.
I agree. Even if you got drunk one night and like forgot to turn on the security system, right? I would still think that, right? So I want to talk. I do want to loop back to the positive rights thing in a minute, but I want to give you a chance to bounce off that.
Yeah, Boonin addresses this argument in his previous book called A Defense of Abortion. Man, he really should have come up with a more original title. As his previous book fleshing out Thompson's argument in the paper of the same title. And he's convinced me that is a good response. So the argument or the objection that Thompson's argument depends, or it only debunks, or it only shows that abortion is permissible in rape cases. I think that objection doesn't work. And I don't want to rely on natural teleology of like consenting to sex is consenting to the possibility of pregnancy. Some pro-lifers are comfortable defending that. I don't think I need to say anything like that to get my point across, because there are all sorts of other sort of cases that pro-lifers have raised that don't rely on any kind of natural teleology like that. So I'm happy to concede that point.
Okay, fair enough. So, I did just want to briefly say something about positive rights because I think what you said is like a sort of obvious, like reasonable worry about anybody who watched the whole show, right? So they watched the earlier segment. Here I am defending positive rights, and now, right? I think when I'm talking about abortion, that bodily autonomy should like really have a lot of weight, and you might think, well, hold on. I mean, if people have positive, have positive rights, then maybe that can justify, right? Violating bodily autonomy. But it seems to me that there's like quite a bit of stuff that I think we would, in terms of violations of personal freedom, that is well short of any of the kinds of examples we've been talking about, including, right, legally requiring people to stay pregnant, that we would, I think everybody would, right, rightly rule out on those grounds as ways to fulfill positive rights. So what I mean is like, if you think, as I certainly do, right, that there's a right to healthcare, if the only way, you still might think, I think very reasonably still might think that if the only way to fulfill that right was by, in fact, frog marching doctors and nurses to work, like the point of a rifle, that would be way too much, right? That in that case, right, when the right to healthcare came into conflict, with the rights of personal freedom, against forced labor, of doctors and nurses, they'd say, okay, never mind, right? That wins. I mean, we're just sort of fortunate that in actual cases, right, it seems very possible to fulfill the first right without such severe violations of the second right. And again, I'd really want to emphasize that, in terms of infringements on bodily autonomy, I think that, forcing somebody to stay pregnant against their will really strikes me as one of the most severe, right, that we can talk about. I mean, that you're, again, as opposed to forcing somebody to take a shot, even forcing somebody to do like a blood transfusion, right? It's a little bit more extreme than forcing them to take a shot. I mean, forcing somebody to be, so physically enmeshed with somebody else, right? Let's just grant personhood here for the sake of argument, right? So physically enmeshed with somebody else that that they're like, that person is like, breathing the oxygen, that you're breathing in through their lungs, that's
sorry.
Oh no,
My light went off. Let me go turn that on.
Oh yeah, no problem.
Oh, okay.
All good. So yeah, it does strike me that, like, look, granting the point, right, that like, I don't know that I'd say that bodily autonomy rights are absolute. I'm sure you could come up with all kinds of cases where I'd be convinced, right, that something else could overwhelm them. I don't claim to have a magical formula in my back pocket for here's exactly how we should weigh competing values against each other so we get the nice, clean lexical ordering system, right? Moral philosophy is hard. But it does strike me that if you give a fair amount of weight to bodily autonomy, that should really go pretty far in this case.
Okay. So I want to consider another case, actually a couple of other cases.
Sure. Yeah.
First I want to consider case, and then I want to ask a general principle question. So how about a case of Siamese twins where one could not be separated from the other except by killing him, right? So this would be a lifetime that they're suppose they're joined at the head, the hip, whatever, imagine whatever kind of case is vivid to you. And the only way that either of them can be free to enjoy their bodily autonomy is by killing the other. It doesn't seem to me like obviously you have a right to do that. And so that's the case. Here's the question. I want to hear what features of pregnancy make it such a severe violation of bodily autonomy, because it could be a number of different things that's being claimed here. One possibility is it's the total cost to the well-being of the pregnant person of enduring the pregnancy, the total cost. That's one view. Another view is there's something about of something being deep inside you, or I don't know, something like that. Like if there were pills that made pregnancy, like that took away morning sickness, that made pregnancy much less painful and much less of a cost to well-being. By the way, my wife and I are expecting our second here in a few weeks, and I thank you. I do have profound respect for what women go through. Obviously, I've not experienced pregnancy myself. I guess maybe the next closest thing is to be living with someone who's experiencing. I understand it is seriously onerous. It is seriously onerous. So I don't want to downplay that at all. But I want to know, is it the total cost to the well-being? Is it about bodily movement and like freedom to move around? Because that's like a different consideration. Is it some combination of that? Is it something else? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that I certainly don't have a precise yardstick for this to offer. I think it is pretty implausible to deny that we can have like at least a sort of rough intuitive ranking of how severe violations of bodily autonomy are, right? That if somebody, if you think about, I don't know, somebody who's like a crazed fan, like snipping off a little bit of hair from a rock star, right? That seems, that seems like it would be a much less severe, violation of their right to control their own body than like, giving them the Pfizer shot, like holding them down and giving them the Pfizer shot against their will, right? So you're like putting a substance in their body, without their permission, and that giving them the shot would be a less severe violation of the bodily autonomy than forcing them to do a blood transfusion, or certainly however you rank those two, certainly either of those two would be like way less than forcing them to give up a kidney, right? So, in other words, I think that even if like, yeah, what's the sort of exactly how do we do the ranking, right? What are the sort of principles we can extract from these intuitions about how we should go about doing the ranking? That even if these issues are a little bit murky, right? Like it does, maybe you have a different, maybe you have a different feeling about this, right? But it does strike me as pretty implausible to deny that that some of these things are more profound violations of your right to control your own body than others of them are, right? Like, and this does seem pretty severe. I mean, maybe it seems pretty severe on a couple of different dimensions, right? That being pregnant, involves temporary-ish, right? But dramatic changes to your body, right? You mentioned morning sickness. You're talking about, again, a level of enmeshment with, for the sake of argument, another person, depending on the stage of pregnancy, we're talking about that's like, that's so extreme that, that you have, that like the process of separation, right, is famously often extraordinarily arduous, right? Like, that I was, just, I don't know, I just had lunch with some relatives the other day, and I was hearing all these stories about people being in labor for like 36 hours and, stuff like that, right? You're talking about, a incredibly painful, incredibly prolonged process for doing the separation, right? I mean, this really seems to me like a hell of a thing to force somebody to do. Maybe for the sake of argument, once we weigh all of our conflicting values as justified, I just really want to emphasize that it is really a hell of a thing to force somebody to do against their will. And I did just want to briefly address the Siamese twins, right? Because I think this is the best objection. And I think that, yeah, I mean, I think so, forcing somebody to stay connected to a twin is pretty extreme. I would say that, like, that one difference is that in this, the Siamese twin case, we're talking about sort of symmetrical body sharing, right? That there's no real sense, as far as I know, right? I mean, maybe there is if we sort of fill out enough details of the case. Maybe I just don't know enough about how twin conjoinment works, but like it does seem like there's no obvious sense in which one of these bodies is hosting the other one, that the other one is just living in it, right? There's just sort of this at least roughly symmetrical relationship between the two, right? So that if you if you killed either one, right, the other one would survive. So there's no I don't know, maybe I'm wrong about the actual like anatomical logistics here. Like I certainly wouldn't claim to know very much about conjoined twins.
I don't see why that is
why it's
more significant. Yeah. It sounds like you're just bodily autonomy is super, super, super important and overrides even a right not to be killed. Oh, but only in pregnancy, not in the Siamese twin, because it's symmetrical. I don't know.
Okay. Let's linger on this point for a second, then, right?
Okay.
So the argument would just be that there's no sense, that like either of the two would have an equally good bodily autonomy, claim, right? To have, to be separated from the other one at the cost of that other one's life, right? So I mean, again, I'm at least assuming, right? This is maybe ignorant on my part, right? But like I'm at least assuming that that's the case, right? So if so, that does strike me as an intuitively different situation than you have, one person who can, survive just fine, right? Without the other, but the other is dependent for their survival on the first one, right? Like that does seem like, if that's right, that you have, that pregnancy in that sense is closer to the violinist and involuntary violinist donor case than the conjoined twins case, that seems relevant, right? So the point is not bodily autonomy is a nothing, right? In the Siamese twin case, I mean, of course it's not, right? Like I actually think if what I'm describing is right, then this might be a kind of moral tragedy, right? That you don't that there's that if you sort of if you granted what in any other case we would regard, right, in every other case besides Siamese twinhood, right? Like I don't think it's just a one-time principle for pregnancy. I think that it's like, I think that again, most of us would regard violations of bodily autonomy far, far, far short of this as just obviously unacceptable in like 99%.
Bone marrow transfusion is less onerous than pregnancy. I do think, though, I want to go back to what you were saying about some of your examples of the graduated levels of involved bodily autonomy. I think some of these cases are underdescribed. Like cutting somebody's hair, if it has like deep religious significance to them, might be a very, very serious infringement of bodily autonomy. If what matters is how important it is subjectively to that person, if that's the metric that we're using or one of the metrics or one component, one serious component of how do we weigh the subjective desire not to have your bodily space infringed with. But let's just suppose we go with that for a while. There are people who are very, very, very serious about being anti-vaxxers and who consider it like, you want me to inject something in my bloodstream?
Yeah. I do just want to interject for 10 seconds to say that would not have occurred to me to think that like the subjective factor was what mattered here. I would just take it for granted that we were doing an objective ranking, but go on.
Okay. Curious, because I would have thought that how it felt subjectively to the person was a huge component of how much it ought to be weighed. But in any event, I think if that were the case, I think we would nonetheless think like, no anti-vaxxer, you have to have your routine vaccinations regardless of that. So that's one thing I guess I want to say. So I don't think, so I think it could be how much the person subjectively doesn't want the intervention to happen. That's one component. Another would be the total cost to the person's well-being. Now, this is another thing that I think is interesting, which is suppose we modify like the original, let's take the original Thompson violinist case.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we're supposed to imagine that the interaction between these two people ends after, if the person stays hooked up, the violinist says, "Thank you, sir," shakes his hand and walks out the door or something. What if it's the case that their lives from then on are going to be intertwined in a way that gives deep meaning and significance to the life of the person who was plugged in to them? So what if I were to tell the person who's deciding whether or not to unplug from the violinist, hey, in the long run, if you stay plugged in to this guy, and if you go through with it, there is a very good chance that you're going to think that that was the right decision from your own perspective, from your own well-being, because that is one feature of that case and all of these cases that tends to be disanalogous with pregnancy. It's not always the case, but often the case. The person who is hooked up through pregnancy gets something positive that I think should count against the obviously very significant upfront costs and well-being, and I think it often outweighs it.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I think that that to me that doesn't seem very compelling, because I think that in most cases, right, when it comes to competent adults or making their own decisions, etc., right? Like, I mean, usually when we're considering forcing people to do things, or maybe not usually, very often, right, when we're considering forcing people to do things, we do think that it would be like to their own long-term good, right? That like, look, we're going to make you take this shot, but like, if you're going to be grateful when you don't die horribly, right? Because of the disease, that the shot prevents. But if nonetheless, in that case, which again does strike me as a vastly milder violation of bodily autonomy, then we still wouldn't say, right? Like, and also, I mean, even certainly in terms of like well-being, right? That the sort of risks that are associated with pregnancy are vastly greater than the risks that are normally associated, with taking a vaccine, right? That the chances, that you'll have some sort of medically serious complication, so much less upfront cost to well-being, much less if you share the basic intuition that's driving me, which it sounds like maybe you don't, but that there is like a sort of pretty clear ranking of like objective violation of bodily autonomy, right? That the person who the person who subjectively is uninterested in what happens to their kidneys, right? That it would still be like a really profound violation, right? To take one of their kidneys, without their consent. That on both of those grounds, right? That this one seems much milder, and it's plausible that you would feel better, like that you would be grateful subjectively later, right? That you had it. I think we would nevertheless, say that this would be this would be seriously unjust to force somebody to do this, or just like go to even loop back to the Cohen eyeball lottery case, right? Like if we also had some sort of program where there was like a very rigorously observed pen pal program for eyeball recipients and eyeball donors, right? Where it was like very likely this happened in many cases, that as people got their lifetime of letters from their formerly blind pen pal, that they came to realize that they were enriching the other person's life, so profoundly that they actually thought it was worth it. I think we'd still normally say that it's that, I don't know. Maybe you just have a different feeling about this, but
I think something's happened. I think the legality argument has crept into the pure moral argument here. I kind of want to bracket the legality stuff just for a minute.
Well, okay, but let's be really clear about what distinction you're making here, right? Because I think that that the sort of main interest that I've always had in this, right, is would it be a serious injustice, right, to forcibly prevent somebody, right, from having an abortion, or to put that differently, right? Would it be like a morally serious injustice to force somebody to remain pregnant against their will, right? And that's kind of the main question that interests me, as opposed to like, is it morally virtuous, to stay pregnant, if you don't want to, or wouldn't otherwise want to if you hadn't been convinced, that it would be morally wrong not to. But maybe there is like a useful distinction here. This will actually help bring out what your view is, right? So like, ultimately, I'm assuming this is not your position, but it would be interesting if it was, right? Because there is a sort of view that you could take that abortion is wrong, but it's like there's sort of no point to trying to legislate against it. This is like the sort of Elizabeth Brunig view. I think that you should just like try to like do other sort of social policy interventions that'll lead there to be less abortions, but you shouldn't, but you shouldn't actually like, use the power of the state to force people not to have them, which if it were your view, I would say, look, it's not my view. We do still have a disagreement there, but like, I have to say that would be a disagreement like I can get much less morally excited about.
No, that's not my view. That's not my view. I do think that if abortion is wrong for the reason that it is wrongful killing of a person or of a human being or of something with significant moral standing, then I don't see a compelling reason why the state shouldn't be involved. That's my position. But I just want to be clear that if I can't convince you of that, maybe I can convince you of some more modest claim.
Okay, yeah. Fair enough. Yeah.
I'm just and I do ultimately think that the morality of it, not the legality of it, is the real interesting question here. So I just imagine, what would I do? I'm hooked up to this violinist here, and I've got to pay this significant upfront cost in well-being. But suppose these other things are true. Suppose somebody has told me that there is a very good chance, not absolute, right? Like I want to be modest about how I set this up. Yeah. But there's a very good chance that if you stay plugged up and to this guy for the whole 9 months, this will work out. This will redound to your benefit in the long run. Is it permissible for me to unplug? Not if I'm being compensated. I'm not so sure. The other thing.
So I want to be as clear as possible about what you just said you weren't sure about, right? So yeah. The claim is putting any questions of like what the laws should be to one side. The claim is that it might be morally wrong to unplug if it was the case that like you yourself would be grateful later that you did that you didn't, or that you there were a couple of things going on here. I want to make sure I'm separating out the threads, or that you would just be properly compensated later, or some combination of those two.
So I want to isolate a variable because two variables go together. Yeah. There's the upfront cost and well-being that the pregnant person is paying, and then there's the pure libertarian consideration of just the appeal to rights. Now, I can see where a libertarian is coming from to say, who cares whether this redounds to my well-being in the long run? It's my body, my choice, and it's my libertarian right that matters here. Yeah. I understand that perspective. I just think that if it's not, I think the more compelling sort of rationale for unplugging is like, look, it's my choice whether I want to make this kind of sacrifice of my well-being for this person.
Okay.
To me, that is the more compelling rationale. Like, do I have an obligation to make this sacrifice for this person? Right.
Okay.
And so that to me is the compelling rationale.
Sorry. So just to be clear, like the case where you were considering, where you were saying, okay, it seems reasonable to me that you might have that obligation, right? What was the difference making thing? Like, what was it that made that reasonable?
Well, so I think we might have very strong positive obligations to other people. I donate to effective charities. I try to, do some positive. I mean, not nearly as much as Singer thinks I ought to. Sure. I'm not living up to that standard, but I feel compelled by, I might have strong obligations to do that. I don't see if Singer is right about those kinds of arguments. I'm not sure why it should end at my bank account as opposed to other sacrifices I might make. The reason why I might not have to make that sacrifice is I might just have a right not to sacrifice my well-being for someone else's. But if it turns out that I'm being compensated, or there's a good chance that I'll be compensated, I think that significantly weakens the case for the permissibility of not helping out the other person.
Okay. So I guess, I mean, it seems to me that, okay, I mean, just to mention this, we don't have to dwell on it, right? But I mean, it does seem to me that while well-being considerations are one very relevant, thing that's going on here, right? I mean, the sort of disadvantages of being pregnant, the medical risks of being pregnant, all of that stuff, right? I mean, that is one very serious consideration here. And by the way, I also think, that the fact that you'll have a serious emotional relation, like that there's a very good chance that you'll have a serious emotional relationship with somebody in the future, to me kind of strengthens the autonomy point, because I think we normally think that, like, this is the sort of thing, whether somebody has an emotionally serious relationship, somebody is the sort of thing that in many other contexts we think should be up to them, right? That there's, I mean, obviously there's some emotionally serious relationships to us that, like, we have no control, that arise in ways that, like, are going to be outside of our control. But I think that, like, generally speaking, we kind of think that who you have, like, strong emotional relationships with is the kind of thing that, that to the extent that it can be, right, should be up to you. But I think, but I would still like just at least plant my flag on separating well-being from autonomy, right? That in other words, like, if I had, if for some reason, right, like, I had to have somebody, like, stitched up to my back, so I was giving them, like, a kind of involuntary piggyback ride, like, like all day for, all day, every day, for months, but they were, like, so light that there were no real physical consequences for me. And the procedure for attaching them and detaching them was, like, painless and risk-free. It still seems to me that, like, that would be, like, a really bad thing to make somebody do, if they didn't want to, right? So I would want to separate autonomy from well-being, but on the well-being point, when you say that, you're at least less sure about it, right? Like, about how far that goes if you're being compensated later, like, what sort of compensation do we have in mind here? I mean, is it like the emotional compensation you were saying earlier?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's a huge part of it. That's a huge part of it. Avoiding avoiding the risk for regret, there actually is some empirical evidence. I looked at the paper, Corinne et al. 2021. It was like a survey of or a study of 161, I think was the sample size of women, and they asked who were denied abortions. They asked, how do you feel about it? Like a week out and then like 5 years out. And overwhelmingly, they were glad that they didn't get them. I think that's an interesting data point.
Although I've also heard the opposite. I mean, like not the opposite, but the complementary thing there, that like overwhelmingly women who do get abortions do not feel regret about it.
Okay, that might be true. That might be true. Let's see. I think there was one more point I wanted to make about the violinist case.
Yeah.
Which was and this comes up. This is another issue I had with Boonan's argument in the Shimp-McFall case, which is I think there is some playing of fast and loose with into like shifting between letting die intuitions and killing intuitions. So I like to give the example like, okay, you can detach from the violinist, but you have to kill him first. You have to like bash his head in with a baseball bat. Don't worry, he's unconscious. Don't worry about that. There won't be any pain involved, but you do have to like physically kill the guy, and then you can unplug him. What's that do to our intuitions? Boonan claims to consider he's like, oh no, I'm considering it a killing because I imagine that the unplugging is initiating a causal process that leads to the death of the violinist. And I'm like, that's kind of weak. That's kind of described still like it's a letting die. Yeah. Now he does make the point that there are forms of abortion where it would probably be better described as letting die rather than killing. And he doesn't see, and the way he reasons is, well, okay, so we could have abortions that are just letting dies, not killings, if you think that's a meaningful distinction. But he doesn't think that there's much of a significant distinction between the killing abortions and letting die abortions. And no. I kind of reason the other way. I take the equivalency and I say, yeah, there doesn't seem to be much killing. There doesn't seem to be much of an intrinsic distinction between the killing abortions and letting die abortions. But why don't we regard them all as the killing ones? Why don't we take you kill the violinist first as like the intuitive anchor point rather than, I don't know, trying to keep that out of view, keeping it nice and tidy where you just unplug and you walk out of the room and you let nature take its course. So
I guess it would be less like bashing the violinist in the head first, and I think more like the way to separate him we just describe in some grisly way where you're doing very clearly killy things, right? In the process of separation. But the part that I did just want to focus on because we're getting close to the end, and this is very much my fault because I took us off in this other direction earlier. But I did just want to make sure you had a chance to circle back to it, right? Is when you were describing the killy version of the sick violinist case, you said, you sort of threw in, oh, and he's unconscious, but whatever, that doesn't matter, right? That's like, and so I am curious, right? Even though I think that our main disagreement here, right, is about to is about bodily autonomy and I mean, look, believe it or not, like the even in the Siamese twin case, like I do feel some pull towards that. I just I really do just think like, well, neither of them seems to have a better claim than the other one, right? But that the way you put that just now, right? Maybe this wasn't intended, right? Made it suggest to take us back for the last few minutes that we have together to the issue that I took us off earlier because I'm really curious about your view, right? Yes. Moral status, right? The way you just put that made it sound like you think that like your sort of view that you would consider defensible. You said earlier that you don't like dismiss like the extreme pro-life view, right? The you know, you have conception, you have moral status from conception onward, right? But you're not sure about it, right? So the way you put it earlier made me wonder if the cutoff point for moral status that you would kind of plant your flag on would still not necessarily rely on consciousness. So I did just want to give you a chance to kind of tell me what your view is on like when fetuses get moral status, like what your view is on when you're relatively confident maybe that fetuses have moral status.
Okay, so I'm a little bit undecided about this. I think there are really only two plausible cutoff points. One of them is conception, right from the get-go, at which point you have a new organism. The other point is where you have the emergence of mind. Now, I don't know when exactly that happens. I tend to think, actually, Nathan Nobos, who is fairly pro-abortion, takes a version of that view, but he tends to estimate the emergence of mind later than I do. I tend to think that mind can be extremely minimal, and still confer moral status as long as you've got a living thing that is conscious, that has some like capacity or potential for future experiences of real value. So one point. Let me make this one point. You mentioned the word capacity in our brief discussion of moral status. I want to point out that it's very hard to draw a line between potentiality and capacity, because the word capacity has a kind of built-in potentiality to it, right? So do I speak Russian? No, I don't speak Russian at all. But do I have the capacity to speak Russian? I think I do. I think I have that capacity.
Yeah, this is the David Lewis line from the Paradoxes of Time Travel that an ape can't speak Finnish, but because it doesn't have the right larynx, whereas I can. But don't take me to Finland. Helsinki is your translator because I can't speak Finnish, right? And he's like, it's just his cute way of like making the point that like can is really ambiguous.
Yeah. So Mary Ann Warren has an argument arguing. She takes the line that the fetus has no moral standing. And if the fetus has no moral standing, we don't even need to get into all of these variations of the violinist case, because it's just like autonomy wins, no contest. But she emphasizes capacity, the capacities of rationality. And I think if that capacity is defined broadly enough that includes infants, then I think it's hard to be confident that it doesn't reach back much, much earlier.
Okay, interesting. Yeah. I guess the part that's confusing to me about that is how the present consciousness piece is connecting to the capacity piece. Like, in other words, like, I understand, like, because if what really matters here, right, is the capacity for future experiences, then yeah, sure, right. Like a fertilized egg has that, right? And arguably so does the unfertilized egg, right? But if what matters is consciousness, right? Then it seems like, well, from what I understand, you don't have like the first flickerings of detectable electricity in the fetal brain until fairly far along in pregnancy, like after most abortions happen. And it also seems plausible to me, without claiming to a knowledge that I don't have about fetal neuroscience, right? But like, my guess would be that like the first flickering of electricity in the fetal brain, considerably predates actual experiences, even very simple ones, right? In sort of much the same way that, my computer being plugged in is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for anything interesting happening on it. So I would, so if what matters is capacity for future experiences, then it's like, yeah, I mean, we're down to the fertilized egg, like the first minutes of the zygote, if not earlier, right? And I actually think it's a really interesting question how to exclude earlier as a possibility. But if what matters is capacity, I guess I don't understand why. I guess I don't understand why it's the conjunction that's important. Like, is that what you're saying? That's the conjunction that's important, the having present consciousness and the capacity for this other stuff later?
That's a possible view. I'm not
Okay.
sure. I'm not sure. I do think that, like, if you consider the case of somebody who's in a coma, I think what matters is future experiences. The
Yeah.
fact that the person has had experiences, I mean, yes, that is a difference between that person and an early fetus who has not yet had the first flickering of consciousness. I'm not convinced it's a morally relevant difference. I'm not convinced of that.
Okay. Well, so just to like quickly recap, because for anybody who's lost track of what the positions are, right? I would just say, like, my own view is that I think before you have conscious experience starting, it seems very implausible to me that you have like the kind of moral status that would make you wrong to kill yet. Although I will also freely admit to being very uncertain about like what the sort of total set of conditions is that you have to meet, and even more uncertain about exactly when in pregnancy that's met. That's all a mess. I wouldn't claim to be sure. But what like really moves me the most in all of this is bodily autonomy, right? So what I'm hearing from you is, okay, we have this big disagreement about bodily autonomy. We spent like an hour on that. We don't need to go back to that, right? But like, but also you think that you have some pretty clear moral status, or actually, no, I want to be really careful that I've got your view right here. It's not that you think we have really clear moral status. It's that like you think that the sort of fuzziness and figuring out when moral status starts gives us like a pretty good reason to err on the side of treating the fetus as something with moral status from at least fairly early on, even if you wouldn't be an absolutist about it. Am I getting you right here?
Yeah, I am relying a bit on a principle of moral caution because I'm not sure exactly where the line is. I'm not confident that it's all the way back. Could I end with a
Yeah.
with a thought experiment?
Go for it.
So I think this is a real case. I heard this from somebody a long time ago. I don't keep up with this person anymore, but feel free to just take it as a hypothetical.
Sure.
Okay. So there was a woman who was raped and was pregnant as a result of that. And compounding that terrible thing and that tragedy, she had cancer that could be treated with chemotherapy. And the doctor advised her to get an early abortion, and because the fetus would not survive this treatment.
Yeah.
Okay. She declined to do it. She carried the fetus to term and then died. And I think it's worth thinking about what we should think of somebody who does that. I think that's heroic. I think at very least, if you don't think that it's heroic, you should have some respect for this person's decision. But if an early fetus is like negligible in terms of its sentience, because I do believe it would have been early that she would have had it. This would have been like me running into my burning house to save my pet goldfish from being destroyed. Like, I just don't think many people are going to have that kind of reaction to this case. I think that intuition I take to be some evidence in thinking. I think even early fetuses have some kind of significance, moral standing. I know it's very, very tragic. It's very sad, and shame on that son of a bitch who put her in that situation.
Yeah, for sure. For sure on that last part. I mean, yeah, I think that's an interesting case because I mean, I think you're right. Most of us, I think would have that intuition, which is at least suggestive of belief in moral status from very early on. I'm sure you're familiar with the sorts of cases that people bring up to suggest that most of us don't really think that deep down, right? Like the sort of like you've got the case with like 500 frozen zygotes in it, and
those cases do give me pause. They do.
Yeah, and like one toddler, and like nobody anywhere would hesitate to save the one. Maybe look, there's always one person, right? But
the
like
utilitarian would.
Yeah, all the more reason to think utilitarianism is demented, but which might actually be something we agree on. But yeah, I think that I think that the stuff I think the coma thing is interesting too, because I think that there's a question there that's like a sort of metaphysics of personal identity question, right? Like what is it that if there's a difference, right? It's got to be that we think that the person after they get out of the coma is the same person, right, as the person before they went into a coma. So there's like there's a person who exists whose existence you're ending, as opposed to just a potential person who could come into existence who you're stopping from. But I will also freely admit here that look, there's a list of subjects I feel pretty sure about. I feel pretty confident about my opinions, and the metaphysics of personal identity is not on that list.
Oh, same here. That's a total mess, that stuff. Yeah, every single view has crazy implications.
Yeah, so I'm not gonna pretend to be like, oh yeah, no, that's like I'm 100% sure that that's right, which is why I think perhaps why the that's definitely not a person yet view is less compelling to me than the sort of autonomy based considerations that I was coming up with earlier. But is there any? I try to, when people are nice enough to come on my show who disagree with me, I try to give them the last word before they go. Is there anything else you wanted to add?
I mean, I could always add more, but I think you've let me say my piece. I think I've said enough, and I'm very grateful that you've given me a platform to do this. I'm very happy to have a left-wing friend who can hear me rant about these things or try to persuade you with them.
You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive postgames on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.